Rabosai, we're on the bottom of DAF Vav Amid Beis, and we're talking about what you do with leftover money that's been accumulated for different holy purposes. We learned in the Mishnah, Mosar Nazir Linadava. If you have leftover money that's accumulated for your Nazir sacrifices, a Nazir has to bring 3 different karbanos at the conclusion of his Nazirism. He's got to bring a shlomim, an ola, and a chatas. So whatever is left over, you have to, from that money, has to be put in the special pushka for nadavas, which is the standard rule. Anytime you have leftover money from a chatas, you put that money in the special pushka for nadava, which is used for the purchase of gift karbanos for the community. Rav Chisda Amar v'hu shekarva chatasu b'sov, avoli karvu shlamim b'sov, mosarin shlamim. And Rav Chisda qualifies that. He says that's only when the last carbon that you brought in your series of 3 was your carbon chatas, in which case we view the leftover money as the residual of that chatas, and that's why it has to go for the nadava. But if your shlamim was brought last, then the surplus is considered to be the remnant of the shlamim sacrifice, in which case it should be used to purchase future karbano shlamim. Now, it would seem to me that this means, because I think the nadava is also used to purchase shlamim, or perhaps it's used to purchase olos. Perhaps that's the difference. So I believe that what it means is that the ola is kadshe kadshim and the shlamim is kadshe kalim, and it's consumable to the bringer. So therefore, it would seem to me that's the distinction that's being drawn. Amar Rabbi Ze'era, afilu karvu shlamim labasov, halacha echas hi benazir shetihiye mosara nedava. And Rabbi Ze'era disagrees, and he says there's one law. Anytime you have surplus monies for a nazir, it doesn't make a difference whether the shlamim was offered last or the chatas was offered last. The fact of the matter is that there was a chatas involved in this accumulation of money, and therefore the leftover money has to be dealt with as kadshe kadshim, as the highest level of kedusha, and therefore it has to go for the purchase of olos that are going to be used in the temple. So the Gemara now says, Masnisa misayeh l'dain umasnisa misayeh l'dain. We have 2 brises. One supports Rav Chisda and one supports Rabbi Ze'era. Masnisa misayeh l'Rabbi Ze'era. The brise that supports Rabbi Ze'era, who says that it makes no difference what was offered last. Anytime there's a korban chatas involved, the surplus is treated with the highest kedusha, because it says as follows: Elohein ma'os stumin kol shedemei chatas mesos meuravos bahen va'afilu hifrish demei chatas mitocha ma'os stumin hein. Ma'os stumin means, according to the Korban Ha'eda, it means money that has to be destroyed because there was sacrificial money that got mixed into this pile of coins. And the halacha is that if a person had set aside money for his korban chatas and then that person passes away, the money has to be destroyed. It has to be thrown into the ocean. So if that money gets mixed in with other coins, even regular chulin coins, all of the money has to be destroyed. And even if you actually extract the equivalent of the money that was set aside for the chatas, let's say $50 of coins gets mixed into $200 of coins. Even if you pull out $50 worth of coins and say, okay, that'll be the money for... No, all of the coins have to be destroyed because you don't know which coins were which. And so what do you see from here? You see from this brisa the basic principle that any surplus monies from a korban chatas that are associated with the korban chatas have to be treated with the same kedusha as the chatas itself, and that's why the money has to be destroyed.
But if you could pick out those $50 worth of coins, then you could.
It's possible. It sounds that way. Masnisa misaya l'Rav Chisda. But we have a brisa that supports Rav Chisda, who says that it depends upon which korban was offered last. If the shlamim was offered last, so then the surplus is the surplus of shlamim, and therefore the money is treated accordingly, that it can be used to purchase karbano shlamim. It says, Elu lechatasi v'hashar l'shar nizirusi, umeis mo'alin bekulan ve'ein mo'alin b'miktsasa. So a person sets aside 2 piles of coins. One pile of coins, this is a nazir, he says, this pile of coins will be for my korban chatas, and this pile of coins will be for my Ola and my Shlomim. And then what happens is, he's basically separated out the Chatas from the Shlomim and the Ola. If a person were to use the coins that are in the pile of the Shlomim and the Ola, he would have to use all the coins for personal use in order to be liable for Me'ila. Why? Because you're only liable for Me'ila when you use Kadshe Kadshim, the higher level of Kedusha, for personal use. If you use coins that only have the status of Kadshim Kalim for personal use, you're not liable for a Korban Me'ila. So if he only uses a portion of the coins, perhaps that portion that he used for personal use was for the Shlomim, and therefore it does not have the higher level of Kedusha, in which case he's not going to be liable for Me'ila. But if you use all the coins in that pile, then you know for sure you've taken for personal use the higher level of Kedusha coins, and then you're liable for Me'ila. But what you do see from here is that we treat these coins that have been segregated out from the Chatas coins as Shlomim and Ola coins, not as surplus Chatas coins. So you see, therefore, that this brisa seems to indicate, even though the cases are not perfectly analogous, this seems to indicate that you can separate out surplus coins even though a Chatas was involved in the middle of them. So this would indicate that the halacha would be that if you offered the shlomim last, then the coins that are left are the surplus from a shlomim and not the surplus from a chatas. Velo omar imeis yiplu linadava. So now the Gemara says, and we don't say that if this man passes away, that these coins have to be given for a nadava. Right? In other words, we don't treat it like Mosar Chatas, we don't treat it like leftover Chatas coins, but rather we say that if he ends up not using the coins, they're treated as Ola coins and Shlomim coins, and we don't have to do automatically what is done for a Chatas. Now, Rav Chisda Amar, Mosar Lachmo Shel Nazir Yurkav. Rav Chisda tells us another halacha having to do with the Nazir, and that is that a Nazir also has to set aside money or flour for a mincha that has to accompany his karbanos. And if he has leftover money or leftover flour, that has to be destroyed. It has to be Yurkav, it has to be allowed to deteriorate. You can't use it for anything. Amar Rabbi Yossi v'yeyos. Rabbi Yossi says that's actually correct. Why? Because lahakrivo b'fnei atzmo in ata yachol she'en ata yachol she'en lecha lechem karev la'atzmo. He says because you can't bring the money for a separate korban mincha without the accompanying animal sacrifices, because the only time that a nazir can bring a mincha is when it accompanies an animal, and you've already done that. So you can't do that. And lahakrivo im nazirus acheres ein ata yachol. Below lechem. You can't pass it forward, this flour or this money, to another nazir for him to use for his korban, because he's already, as soon as a person accepts nazirus upon himself, he has automatically obligated himself to bring the requisite animal and flour offerings. So since he's already made a personal pledge to bring his own flour, he cannot use someone else's flour instead of his. And therefore, lefum kain sarach meimar moser lachmo shel nazir yurkav. And therefore, since there's nothing else that you can do with this flour or the money that was set aside for the flour, it has to be destroyed. Now, Savrin Meimar hu lachmo hu moser nesachav. The thinking is that the same thing can be said about the accompanying wine libation that is supposed to come along with the animal karbanos of the nazir. And therefore, if you have anything left over, you have to destroy it. Amar Reb Yossi bar Rebbe Bon, no. Mosar nesachav kadshe kadshim inon v'yiplu l'nedava. He disagrees, and he says no. The leftover libation money or wine shall be used for the nedava. Take that money and put it in the pushka, just like you would use for a korban chatas, since it has the status of kadshe kadshim, of the higher level of kedusha. Just like you take moser chatas and put it in the nedava pushka, so too you take moser nesachim money and you put it in the pushka. Apparently, mincha does not have the status of kadshe kadshim. Perhaps that's what it seems like from the Gemara, that the flour part does not have the status of kadshe kadshim, but the nesachim does, and therefore it goes for the nedava pushka.
I don't understand the argument still about the mikvah. I understand the distinction between the mikvah and wine, but But I mean, if I made a netter that I was going to do something, I was going to offer something, and then I said, and then somebody came and said, I'm going to give this to you now, and so I've transferred the ownership, and now it's mine.
But it wasn't yours to give. It was already sanctified with the kedusha of Nazirus. It was sanctified. If I was a Nazir and I have leftover stuff, my item's already been sanctified. I can't
give it away.
Right? It's non-transferable. Okay.
You could bring a second by itself without because you can bring wine libation as something you can bring on your own.
Yeah, but not if it's already been sanctified for Nazirus. Not if it's been sanctified for Nazirus. That's the whole point. You're allowed to bring a mincha by itself also, but not if it's been sanctified for Nazirus. So al daite de Rabbi Yossi by Rabbi Bon, Shmuel Aliba de Rabbi Chisda, b'Moser Nesachim, de Rabbi Chia de Rabbi Lazar. There's a big problem with the Girsa here, but there are three rabbis, basically, Shloshtan Amru Davar Echad. Three rabbis have said the same thing, that anything that is sanctified with the higher level of Kadshe Kadshim, the leftover gets put into the Nedava Pushka. So Echad, Amr Davar Davar Echad, Rabbi Chia Ahada Amran, Rabbi Chia, who was the author who said that the Nesachim of the Nazir get put into the Nedava Pushka, that's what we just said, that's one. Two is Shmuel, Da Amar Rabbi Yossi, Ada'ana Taman, Shamaz Kal Rabbi Yehuda Shal Shmuel, Hifri Shkalo, Umes. When I was in Bavel, I heard Rabbi Yehuda ask Shmuel the following question. If a person set aside his machatzis shekel, which is supposed to be used to purchase communal karbanos, which are of the status of kadshe kadshim, and then the person who set aside his machatzis shekel dies, what should be done with that shekel? Amarle yiplu nedava, and Shmuel answered him that it should be placed in the nedava pushka. So once again, you see something that is sanctified with kadshe kadshim status. If it's surplus, then it gets put into the nedava pushka. And Rabbi Lazar Omer, Mosar Asiris Haifa Shalo, Rabbi Yochanan Omar Yolichem Liyam Hamelach, and Rabbi Elazar Omer Yiplu L'Nedava. There's a problem with the gears here because you got two times Rabbi Elazar. And so you have to read it as Rabbi Elazar de Itmar, Mosar Asiris Haifa Shalo, Rabbi Yochanan Omar Yolichem Liyam Hamelach, and Rabbi Elazar Omer Yiplu L'Nedava. That's the way the Gra has the girsa. So the third opinion is Rabbi Elazar.
Shammai told us.
Shammai said when you have the leftover Asira Saifa. Yeah. So he was talking about a different Asira Saifa. He was talking about the one that belonged to that was the whole issue that we had the other day. Which Asira Saifa is being discussed in the Mishnah? So I don't think that was exclusively Shammai. No, that was our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was not just Beis Shammai. The Mishnah said Asira Saifa Mosar and Nedava. It goes for the Nedava. But this Brisa attributes our Mishnah to Rabbi Elazar, because we have three opinions in this Brisa. What do you do with the leftover Asira Sa'efa, the tenth of the Efa of flour that a poor man brings as a Chattas offering, as a sin offering? So either he gets to keep it according to the Tanakama. Rabbi Yochanan says he has to destroy it, and Rabbi Elazar says it goes for Nedava. Bottom line is that you see that anything that has Kadshe Kadshim status, according to these three rabbis, always goes into the Nedava, just like a surplus Korban Chattas item. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Halacha Hey. Masnisin, Mosar Shavuyim L'Shvuyim. That if a community raises money to ransom a hostage, so then whatever surplus is left from that collection has to go for future ransoming mitzvahs, of the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim. Mosar Shavoy La'oso Shavoy. If it was raised for a specific person, let's say we raised money for Yankel, who's a hostage, and then we raised so much money that we have surplus, then we should give the surplus money to Yankel once we ransom him and he becomes free.
Becomes a rich man.
Yeah, maybe he hired the guys to kidnap him.
You don't want the kidnappers to know you're building up a fund.
That's right. So
we could say Gilad Shalit. We don't have to
right. I mean, look, there's a lot of precedents. This is a really serious discussion, because there were times when Rabbanim said, don't ransom me.
What's the name was the guy lost in jail? He said
Rami Rotenberg, right? Okay. Moser aniyim la'aniyim. If you raise money for the poor generically, then if you have, let's say, leftover surplus money after you fed all the poor, save it for the next iteration of distributions. And Mosar ani la'osa ani. But if you raise money for a specific poor man, even if you've taken care of whatever his needs are, you give him the rest of the money. Yeah. So Baruch Hashem. Mosar hamesim lemesim, that if you raise money for the Chevra Kadisha to be able to bury the indigent dead, so then whatever surplus you have, you keep in that fund. But Mosar hames liyorshav. But if you raise money for a specific decedent who is indigent, and you have leftover money for that particular individual, you give the surplus to his heirs. So Rabbi Meir Omer Moser Hames Yehumunachat Sheyavo Eliyahu. Rabbi Meir says, no, I don't agree. It's not clear to me that when people gave that money, they meant it to go to his heirs. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, and so therefore leave the money until Eliyahu Navi comes and tells us what to do with it. But Rabbi Nassan Omer Moser Hames Bonu Lo Nefesh Al Kivro. Rabbi Nassan says, no, you don't have to give it to the heirs. That's not even part of the issue. Anytime you raise surplus money to bury the dead, you could always do more elaborate a headstone, and you can build them a mausoleum if you have extra money. Put a few stones on the tombstone. You know that story about the woman whose husband left her $25,000 for the stone, so she bought him a pine casket and bought herself a nice diamond ring. That was the stone. Okay, so the Gemara now says,
that's a nice ring to it.
Yeah. So the Gemara now says, Gavulo b'cheskas she'ein lo v'nimsa sheyesh lo. What happens if a person nebuch is nifter? We thought the guy was the poorest of the poor, and then we raised the whole fund for him, and then it turns out that he had a Swiss bank account with millions of dollars in it. So what are we supposed to do? We don't need this money anymore. The guy had plenty of money to be buried. So Rabbi Yirmiyah savar meimar amosar hameis liyarshav. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, whatever you've raised, give it to his heirs. So Amarle Rabbi Idi the chutra hagatzma delo kavnan. Elalei. So Rav Idi Medechutra says to his Rabbi Yirmiyah, he says, Rabbi, you better check yourself. I mean, this doesn't make any sense to me. He says, because they didn't intend the money to go to the heirs, they intended it only to go to him. So you're going to see in just a minute that this Gemara we're going to see some Agadata today about anger management among the rabbis, because Rabbi Yirmiyah immediately gets angry with his Talmud. Amar le, ana lo amris at minon lach. I never told you the halacha about what you're supposed to do with the leftover money. Where do you get the chutzpah to decide on your own what should be done with that money? In other words, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, you wouldn't know anything if it weren't for me, so where do you get off to tell me what the halacha should be? So Tani b'shem Rabbi Nassan, Mosar hameis yivna lo nefesh al kivro v'yasa lo ziyuf al gabi mitaso. And we have a brisa of Reb Nassan, which is an elaboration on our Mishnah, which says that whatever leftover money you have collected for this particular decedent, build him a nicer stone or mausoleum, and also you can purchase expensive deodorizing wine, which they used to sprinkle on the corpse as they would escort him out, so that he wouldn't emit any offensive odors.
Right, why not leave it for Eliyahu? Because people gave the money for a different reason. They thought he was poor.
So that's the issue. The issue here is that if they collected it for this guy, they did it unconditionally for this guy. That's what Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying. I'm sorry. That's what whatchamacallit. That's what Ravidi is saying. So anyway,
there's never the option of returning it to those who gave it.
Well, there perhaps is that option, but that's not what is being advocated here. Maybe it's not practical. Maybe it's difficult. So Tani, ein podin shavoi b'shavoi ve'ein govin talis b'talis ve'ein memachin biyat parnasim lakach. Now we have another brisa that says as follows: if the gaboy tzedakah collect money for a particular hostage or captive, we're not allowed to. Let's say that guy is taken care of. We're not allowed to switch the money to another captive. We're not allowed to do that. And furthermore, if, let's say, money was allocated to make a purchase of one kind of a garment for, let's say, communal needs, we're not allowed to switch it to buy a different garment if we've discovered that that original garment is no longer needed. However, at the same time, the ein memachin biyat parnasim lakach. But we still should not make a stink if the collectors or the providers of the community do decide to change allocations in this fashion. In other words, even though it's not proper to do it, but if the parnasim, if the community leaders do make that decision, we have to respect it. And why is that? So like the Korban Ha'eda says, because it was understood when people made contributions to these communal leaders, they entrust them with making prudent decisions and making substitutions as they see fit. So Tani Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, Hein Osin Nefashos L'Tzadikim, Divreihem Hein Hein Zichronim. Related to this issue of making an elaborate tombstone, Reb Shimon Gamliel says that there's no need to make an elaborate tombstone for a tzaddik, because their words, the way that what they taught in their lifetime, is their greatest epitaph, and therefore there's no need to make elaborate verbiage over their grave. Rabbi Yochanan have a masmich, which is ironic because if you look at the kevarim of famous tzaddikim, you find that sometimes, I remember just seeing a picture of Moshe's kever in Har Menuchos. I think it's on Har Menuchos. It's like on all four sides. There's elaborate writing, but according to the Yerushalmi, it's superfluous. It's not necessary. Rabbi Yochanan have a masmich ve'azal. Here's another story about anger management. Rabbi Yochanan was once schlepping along. Now, the reason why he says he was schlepping along, he had to lean on someone when he was walking because he was a big bal basar. He was a very large, corpulent man, and he needed to lean on someone while he was walking. All Reb Chia bar Abba, so accompanying him was, I think this is the correct girsa. I'm just trying to see if there's a girsa change here. So Reb Chia bar Abba accompanied him, and again, part of this entourage, V'haya Rabbi Elazar chamilei umetamerlei mikamei. Rabbi Elazar sees Rabbi Yochanan coming, and he quickly runs away and hides. Rabbi Yochanan notes this and becomes upset. The Amar Halein Tarti Milahu Hadein Bavla Avid Bey. He says, look at the two offenses that this Babylonian has committed. Chada, you see all the time there's this rivalry between the Babylonians and the Palestinians. Palestinians meaning the Eretz Yisrael rabbis. Chada de lo shoel bishlomei v'chada mitamer. One, it's not bad enough that he didn't come over to say Shalom Aleichem to me, but beyond that, he goes ahead and runs past me and hides? What's going on over here? So Amarle Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, so Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi tried to explain Rabbi Elazar's actions, and he said, Kach nehigin gabahon deze'era lo shoel bishlomei de rabba. He says that's the minhag in Bavel, that a lesser sage never initiates shalom to a greater sage. It's considered to be an act of disrespect to go over and say, hey, Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi, how you doing? That's considered to be disrespectful. De'enon nahagun umekaimin ra'uni na'arim v'nechba'u v'yashishim kamu amdu. He says, because they look at the pasuk in Eov, which says that the youth see me and they hide, and it's only the elders who arise and come towards me. So Rabbi Elazar views himself as your lesser, because he's your Talmud, and therefore he was embarrassed. He felt it would be disrespectful to come over to you and wish you, extend shalom to you. So Amar Lei Mahu Lemiyeved Kame Da Adura Tzalme. So another sort of argument that was presented to Rabbi Yochanan was that he said, the student said to Rabbi Yochanan, what would be the halacha? Is it proper to, when you're passing by a tselem, lemi'aver kamei da'adur d'tzalme, if you're passing by an idol, do you have to do anything to sort of demonstrate that you are contemptuous of the idolatrous statue? In other words, are you obligated to do anything when you walk past an avodah zarah? So what are you supposed to do? So Amarle ma'at poligle yakar avor kamoi b'samaye. So Rabbi Yochanan said back to him, no, of course not. You don't have to be fearful of this idolatry. It's completely nothing. And therefore, just cover your eyes and keep walking. You don't have to take a detour. In other words, by doing anything, you're essentially showing that it has credence, it has some importance. And so therefore, the best thing is just to avert your eyes and just keep walking. So Amarle, Yeyos Rebbe Elazar Avid Delo Avar Kamach. So Rebbe, that's why Rebbe Elazar did the right thing. He knew that it was taboo for him to go over to you and greet you. He didn't want to do anything that would be a sign of disrespect, and so therefore, just like you should just walk past an idol so as not to do anything incorrect, he also felt it would be better just to walk past you and hide instead of doing anything proactive to violate the precept of not initiating shalom.
He's comparing it to mine.
Yeah.
Well, it's a loose, obviously you see that it's different, so yeah. Va'od. But then Rabbi Yochanan said, okay, but wait a minute, he did something else offensive to me. Ha bavla delo amar shmaita mishmei. He says, but this Babylonian student of mine has committed another offense. Rabbi Yochanan is still quite upset. He says, listen, Rebbe Elazar teaches my words, and he doesn't quote me. He doesn't give attribution. When he says over my teachings, he doesn't quote me. So, nichnasu lefanav Rebbe Ami v'Rebbe Asi. Amru lo, Rebbe kacha yamaisa beveis hakneser shel Tarsiim. That Rebbe Ami and Rebbe Asi see how upset Rebbe Yochanan is, and they tried to prevail upon him to calm down. And they said, Rebbe, there was once a story in the synagogue of Tarsiim that ben nagar sheyesh barosho glustera, about a pestle which has a knob on it, so therefore it's considered a handle, and therefore it's considered to be a kli. And there was a debate whether this pestle is considered to be muktzah or not. Is it enough of a kli to be considered to be something movable on Shabbos, or is it something that you're not allowed to move on Shabbos? Is it muktzah or not? And shenechleku Rabbi Eliezer v'Rebbi Yossi ad shekaru sefer Torah b'chamasan. And these two sages, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Eliezer, got so angry with each other in the course of debate that they ended up tearing a Sefer Torah in the course of their anger. So what Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi were trying to impress upon Rabbi Yochanan is that it's not appropriate to get angry. Rebbe, please, just relax, calm down. You have a criticism of your Talmud, that's one thing, but don't lose your temper. So the Gemara just questions the story, and it says, Karu sal gedaitach? You really think that they would tear, even in their anger, two great sages would tear a Sefer Torah? Ela shenikra Sefer Torah. But rather what happened was, no, accidentally, because they were in such a fury, someone was holding a Sefer Torah and it got torn because they were like so animated. But not that they deliberately did it, but still the same thing is v'hayasham zakin echad v'Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma shmo amar timihanim lo haya beis hakneses ze beis avodah zara. So he said. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma is witness to this whole thing, this angry this demonstration, and as a reason, which causes the Sefer Torah to get torn, Rachmana litzlan, and he says, I don't know whether this is a real synagogue. Maybe it's just a house of idolatry. And like I think the Taklon Chadatin points out, anyone who gets angry, the Gemara says, as if he's worshiping idols. So this is not a house of prayer, of serving God. This is a house of idolatry. Look how people get angry in here. Very important. Next time there's a board meeting and someone gets upset, you can quote this Yerushalmi Aleph. V'chazar v'amar hachadein mechavre. So v'chazar v'amar. So then, let me just see. V'chazar v'amar hachadein mechavre. What does this mean? The Taklon Chadatin says, okay. So Rabbi Yochanan said, that's not a good citation to calm me down. He says, because it's one thing when two colleagues argue with each other, it's wrong for them to express anger. But it is acceptable for a teacher to express anger at a student for doing something insulting to his teacher. So therefore, don't bring me rayas from the story about two colleagues who were inappropriately angry with each other. It's appropriate for me to become angry with my students. So no one was able to calm him down. So therefore, nichnas lefanav Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi. So then Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi comes in and he says, Amar leiksiv kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe avdo, kein tziva Moshe es Yehoshua. In Sefer Yehoshua it says that just like God commanded the mitzvahs to Moshe, Moshe similarly commanded the mitzvahs to Yehoshua. So let me ask you, he says, Rabbi, V'chi kol dibur v'dibur sheYehoshua Yoshe v'dorish haYaomer kach omer Moshe? Do you think it was necessary when Yehoshua was expounding on Torah teachings that every sentence he said, he had to say, Hat gezakt Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe, this is what Moshe said? Of course not. Eli Yehoshua Yoshe v'dorish v'yodin hakol she'atorah shel Moshe. He says, when Yehoshua sat and taught, everyone knew that the only source that was available to teach him Torah was his Rebbe Moshe, so it was unnecessary, it was superfluous for him to give attribution to Moshe. So Af Ata Elazar Yoshe v'Doresh v'Hakol Yodin Sha'Torah Shalachi. So too, the reason why Rabbi Elazar did not feel it necessary to give you attribution is because it was so obvious it was self-evident that all of his wisdom comes from you, Rebbe. So he felt it was obvious to everyone that anything that he said was from your wisdom. Finally, something to calm down Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so Amar Lahen, Mipnei ma enaten yodim l'ratzos kiben idi chavereinu. So Rabbi Yochanan turns to all of his previous students and he says, I wish you guys would have the wits to be able to calm me down like Rav Yaakov bar Idi, our friend.
No, they're going to get angry.
Right. Anyway,
soothing his ego.
They stick up for their friend.
What?
They stick up for their chaver.
They stick up for their chaver. That's another important lesson in the story. If the Rebbe is upset, so the other ones have to stand up for him and try to make shalom, try to calm things down.
That's where there's some ego going on here.
Maybe, but those rabbis. They got big egos. Okay. For Rabbi Yochanan, my kulei de boy de yamun shmaita mishmei. So now the question is, why was Rabbi Yochanan so hung up that he should be given attribution? Is it an ego issue? That's really what the Gemara is asking. And the Gemara says no. DAF David bikesh alei rachamim. David asked for the same thing. Shenamar agura bi ahalecha olamim echese b'seiser kenafecha sel. David says in Tehillim, oh, that I could live in your tent forever, and that I could take protection under the cover of your wings. So the Gemara's question is, V'chi also al daito shel David sheyeh chai v'kayim la'olamim? Did David really think that he could live forever? What was he asking for? Elakach amar David lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What he was saying was as follows: Ribbono shel olam ezke sheyehu devarai ne'emar b'batei kinesios u'b'batei midrashos. He says, would it only be, Hashem, that people quote me even after I'm dead in the Beis Medrash and the Beis HaKnesses, and in doing so, I live on eternally. So that's really what Rabbi Yochanan was pining for. He was looking for some sense of permanence in his legacy. It wasn't that he had an ego, is that he felt that his Torah deserved to be perpetuated, just like David wanted the same thing. Shimon ben Nazira b'shem Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, Kol Talmid Chacham Shomrim Devar Halacha Mipiv Ba'olam Hazeh Sefasav Rochashos Imo Bekever. That any person who has passed from this world, if you cite the words of that righteous person, then his lips move in the grave. And we see that Chazal and other places take this quite literally, that there's animation that is granted to the decedent through the movement of his lips, even after he is dead, since people are quoting him. As it says in Shir Hashirim, that your palate is like the good wine, moving the lips of those who sleep. So why is this? What is the analogy to wine? That if you have a container of wine, just by sticking your finger into the surface, you immediately cause the wine surface to ripple. So too, afsif soseim shel tzadikim, keven shomim dvar halacha mipiyim shel tzadikim sif soseim meracha shos imohim bekever. So too, as just saying something in the name of a decedent causes immediately their lips to move in the grave, to mouth the words. Mahana'a lo. What benefit does the decedent get when he is quoted? So Bar Nazira Omar Kahaden Deshasi Konditon. Bar Nazira says it's like a person drinking konditon. Konditon is spiced wine. It's wine that's mixed with spices. And Rabbi Yitzchak Omar Kahaden Deshasi Chamaratik Afal Gav Deshasi Leitaima Befuma. And Rabbi Yitzchak says it's like aged wine, that even after you've drunk it, the flavor lingers in your mouth. The question is, what is the machlokis between whether the wine or whether the Torah that's quoted in your name is like konditon or like aged wine? The Korban Eda suggests that konditon, which is aged wine represents Torah, and spice represents masim tovim, represents good deeds. And the only time that a person has this merit to have his lips move after he's dead is if not only he taught Torah, but he lived a life of good deeds so that people could emulate him. And only then does he benefit from this combination of wine and spice. And Rabbi Yitzchak disagrees, and he says, no, as long as this man's Torah teachings have some permanence in this world, that's all that's necessary for his lips to move and for him to benefit thereby. Rav Gidol Amar Ha'omer Shmuah b'Shem Omro Yira Bal Shmuah Ki'ilu Omed Lenegdo. Anytime you quote someone as having said something, you should imagine that person's visage, their face, right in front of you. And the reason is because then you'll be assured of quoting it more accurately, because you'll be able to sort of reenact how that person would have said it. Shenamar Ach B'Tzelem Yishalech Ish, as the pasuk says that a person should walk with the image in front of him. Kesiv Rav Adam Yikra Ish Chasdo. There's a pasuk, and this pasuk is in Tehillim. No, it's a pasuk in Mishlei. That Rov Adam Yikra Ish Chasdo, that the majority of man shall call out a man in his kindness. Now, what that means is, according to the Korban Ha'eda, that Zeh Sha'ar Kol Adam. Right? That refers to most people. Most people, whenever they quote someone else's Torah, which is the chesed that we're talking about in the pasuk, they don't give necessarily proper attribution to the person they're quoting. But v'ish emunim miyimtza ze Rebbe Ze'era. But the end of the pasuk says, and who can find the man of faith, the man who is faithful? That refers to Rebbe Ze'era, who was punctilious to a flaw about giving proper attribution. He always made sure that whenever he heard a quotation, he would make sure that proper attribution was given. And we'll see this in the following illustrations. The Amar Rebbe Ze'era, les non srichin cheshashin lishmaite de Rav Sheshes, de hugavra miftecha. Rebbe Ze'era felt that if a person was blind, then you could not necessarily rely on his teachings with full accuracy, because the person who was blind never really knows from whom he's hearing the teaching. And therefore he cannot give proper attribution. And therefore he says that Rav Shesh's teachings, Rav Sheshes was blind, they're not necessarily reliable, because Rav Sheshes never knew for sure from whom he was hearing the teaching. So you see how careful Rebbe Ze'era was attribution. He felt that that really meant everything. And Amar le Rebbe Ze'era le Rebbe Asi, Chakim Rebbe le Bar Pasia da'at Amar Shmaita Mishmei, question mark. Rebbe Ze'era once heard Rebbe Asi quoting a sage named Bar Patia. And he said to him, were you a student that actually heard shir from Bar Patia that you can quote him directly? So Amar le Rabbi Yochanan Amra Mishmei. He says, no, Rebbe, you're right. Rabbi Yochanan actually had taught it to me in the name of Bar Patia. So you see that Rebbe Ze'era was very makpid, was very careful that if you're going to quote someone, quote it accurately. Don't say that this is what Bar Patia said that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Bar Patia. Amar le Rebbe Ze'era le Rebbe Asi, Chacham Rebbe l'Rav da'at Amar Shmaitza Mishmei. So similarly, Rebbe Ze'era once said to Rebbe Asi, who had quoted something in the name of Rav, he said, were you a student of Rav to hear shir from him that you could quote him? Amalei Rav Ada bar Ahava Amar Mishmei. He said, you're right, Rebbe. I really only heard it from Rav Ada bar Ahava, who in turn heard it from Rav. So Rebbe Ze'era wanted to correct all of these kinds of situations. Then the Gemara continues by discussing David HaMelech, who we talked about it just a moment ago. Ein dor she'ein bo leitzanim kedor shel David. The generation filled with the most mockery and scoffing was the generation of David HaMelech. He says, Mahu Prutse Hador Osen, what were the chutzpahdik, brazen people of that generation? How did they behave? Hayuholchen Eitzel Chalonosav Shel David, Omrin Lo, David, Emasa Yibona Beis HaMikdash, Emasai Beis Hashem Neilech. They would stand by David's window and they would say, David, when will the temple be built? When will we be able to go to the house of God? They knew full well that Hashem had told David that he could not build the temple. The temple would only be built when he died. So basically, they were saying to him, David, when are you going to drop dead already, so that we can build the Beis HaMikdash? So V'haya David Omer, Afal Pisha Miskavnu Lahach Iseni Yavo Alai Im Lo Hayisi Sameach B'Divreihem. He says, even though I know that these people were doing this to intimidate and provoke me and to get me upset, nevertheless, I do declare that I was quite rejoiceful when I heard them say these things, because clearly they were demonstrating their yearning for a temple, even though they had malicious intent. But nevertheless, I'm very happy that even the bad rapples among the Jews are pining for a temple. What? Barditchever, right. As it says in the pasuk, I rejoiced when they told me, let us go to the house of God. But God says to David, no, only when your days are filled shall you lie with your fathers. So really what Hashem was telling David is, Amalo HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeDavid, Yamim Shaleimim Ani Mona Lecha V'lo Yamim Chaserim. I'm going to give you a full life. You're not going to die early. Klum Shlomo Bana Bincha Yivna Beis Hamikdash Ela Lahakriv Karbanos Tzibor. He says the whole purpose of your son Shlomo building the temple is so that the Jews can bring communal karbanos. But Chaviv Alai Tzedako Mishpat Shata Ose Yosem in HaKarban. But whatever that you're doing in your lifetime as far as justice and righteousness in your lifetime is more precious to me than any communal sacrifice that will be brought by your son. Shenamar Oset Tzedako Mishpat Nivchar Lashem Mizevach. That he who does justice and righteousness is choicer, is more beloved to God than even a korban. So therefore, David, I'd rather you live and you live your life in righteousness than to have a temple be built. Hadron Alach Mitzar from Shkalim. Let's quickly do the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Bishlosha Prakim Bashana Tarmanes Alishka. Now we've seen this Mishnah cited before. There are 3 times in the year when they do the scooping out of the Lishka to use the coins for the purchase of communal sacrifices. Bipros HaPesach, Bipros HaAtzeres, Bipros HaChag. Half a month before Pesach, half a month before Shavuos, and half a month before Sukkot. Behem Goranos Shal Ma'aser Behema Divrei Bekiva. Also, this is also the time when we tell people to tithe their animals, because this is a time when new animals are born, every 10th animal has to be tithed and brought, segregated from the rest of the herd, and brought as a korban in the temple. So Ben Azai Omer be'esem b'tisha ba'adar uve'echad b'sivan uve'esem b'tisha ba'av. He argues and he says it's not 2 weeks before Pesach, 2 weeks before Shavuos, and 2 weeks before Sukkot, but rather slightly different configuration. He says it's on the 29th of Adar, on the 1st of Sivan, and the 29th of Av, which is a full month and a half before Sukkot. Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon Omrim, Be'echad B'Nisan, Be'echad B'Sivan, B'Chavtes Be'elul. They say also slightly different. They say the 1st of Nisan, the 1st of Sivan, and the 29th of Elul. V'lama Amru B'Chavtes Be'elul. It would really make sense more logically to say the 1st of Tishrei, if you started off by saying the 1st of Nisan and the 1st of Sivan. However, V'lo Amru Be'echad B'Tishrei, B'nei Shehu Yom Tov, V'yev Shela Aser B'Yom Tov, L'ficha Chikdimuhu B'Chavtes Be'elul. It's because the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah. You're not allowed to tithe animals on a Yontif, and therefore they pushed it back to the 29th of Elul. The Gemara will explain the machlokes of all the 3 opinions. The Gemara now says, Amar Rabavohu Kol Hein de Taninan Pras Palga. Anytime you find the word pras in the Mishnah, it means a half of something. And here too, it's no exception. And another example is Palga de Lamed Yom Kodem Lemoyed Shedarshan B'Hilchosav. Pras HaPesach means a half a month before Pesach, and this is also the time when you're supposed to begin giving drashos about the laws of Pesach. Vehein Garanos, and that's also the time, says the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Akiva, that you're supposed to do Meiser Behema, these 3 times in the year. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mibnei Shein Pirkei Leida. One reason, says Rabbi Yochanan, is that this is the time when many animals are born. In other words, if you're a farmer, you know that animals are typically born around the 1st of Nisan, around 2 weeks before Shavuos and the 2 weeks before Sukkot. Rabbi Achav, Rabbi Tanchum, Bar Chia b'Shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kedei Shetiya HaBehema Mitzuya La'olei Regolim. He gives a different reason why you're supposed to tithe dafka then. If we allowed you to tithe any time before or after, you might not have enough livestock to provide for people who want to purchase animals for the Yom Tov. But by telling you, listen, don't do any tithing until it's just right before the Yom Tov, this way you'll accumulate more animals, because you won't be able to use the rest of your animals until you've accumulated a whole bunch of livestock. Then you'll do the meiser, and then it'll turn out that your herds will be flush with cattle and sheep, and therefore there'll be an abundance of animals to sell to people who want to make aliyah l'regel. Amar Reb Yudan shelo yavo l'idei bal ta'acher. He says another reason. Since every animal that you tithe, the meiser behem has to be brought as a korban, we want to ensure that you're not going to delay bringing the animal. So we tell you, do it right before the Chag, so that when you make Aliyah L'Regel, you'll bring all your Meiser Behemoths with you, and you'll be able to bring them as a korban at the proper time, because there's an Isser of Bal Ta'acher, of not delaying your sacrificial obligations. And Amar Rabbi Yosa, Kol Hamasha Tivlo over B'Bal Ta'acher. Consistent with this, Rabbi Yossi says that not only is there an Isser of Bal Ta'acher when you make a pledge of any other korban to God, but also the law of Meiser Behema, also, if you neglect to bring it in a timely fashion, you violate the Yisr of Bal Ta'acher, of do not delay bringing your korban. And that's why there's an urgency of doing the tithing immediately before the Chag, to ensure that there's a greater chance that you'll bring it up into the temple at the proper time. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Rabbi Chanan ben Akasha.